For this lesson, we are going to be looking at solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. So make sure that you have these notes sitting in front of you prior to going through this lesson with me. Remember that this lesson page can be found in Google Classroom. So just like the title says, we're going to be solving the quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. And you will see on this first slide what exactly the quadratic formula is. There's a bunch of A, B's, and C's in the formula in order to find what your x equals. Remember, when we're solving an equations, we're trying to figure out what x equals, and this formula helps us do it. All these little A, B's, and C's come from the standard form of a quadratic equation. So we always want to make sure that our equation that's given to us is in standard form before we plug it into the quadratic formula. So the number that sits in front of the x squared represents the A. You can see that A appears twice in the formula. Next to the x is your B. You can see that B appears twice in your formula. And the constant, the number without a variable, your C, you can see appears one time in the formula. So we always want to make sure that everything is over here to the left and that it is set equal to 0 before we actually plug into the quadratic formula. So looking at examples, we want to solve each quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. We're going to round all of our answers to the nearest hundredths. We will eventually be learning how to simplify radicals in a later lesson. So until we learn that lesson, we're just going to be plugging everything into a calculator so that we can get these decimal answers if they are decimals. So notice on example 1, it is in standard form. You have your A, your B, your C. It is set equal to 0. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to kind of circle the different numbers, label them A, B, and C so that they're easier to then pull and put into the formula. So this 3 right here, that's our A. No number meaning 1, that's our B. And then this -3 right here is our C. So A is 3, B is 1, C is -3. So I'm going to plug those into the quadratic formula. So I have x equals, it says -b. Well, B was 1, so a negative B would be a -1. Then in the formula, you see plus or minus the square root of b squared. So we have 1 squared minus 4, just following the formula again, times A, which is 3, times C, which is -3. And this whole thing will be over 2 times A, which is 3. So again, just plugging those numbers into this formula so that we can find the answers. So just continuing with this, we have that -1. I'm just going to carry that over, plus or minus the square root. Let's see, 1 squared is 1. And then in your calculator, you can take -4 times 3 times -3, and you would get 36, positive 36. So we're going to say plus 36 all over 2 times 3, which is 6. So again, we just plugged in the numbers into this formula, and now we're just simplifying it. So going even further with this, carry over the -1 again, plus or minus the square root. 1 plus 36 is 37. And then we're just going to divide by 6. So now all we have to do is split this up, because this plus or minus means there's 2 answers. There's the answer that we get from taking -1 plus the square root of 37 and dividing that answer by 6. And then we also have the answer that comes from -1 minus the square root of 37 and dividing that by 6. So we're just going to plug these into the calculator. Remember, you have those 2 calculators, virtual ones, or you can use your cell phone calculator if you need to. So we're going to type in the calculator -1 plus the square root of 37. We're going to hit enter, and then we're going to take that answer and divide it by 6. And when I do that, I get 0.8. And then that 7 is going to round the 4 up to a 5. So I get 0.85. Then I'm going to do the same thing for this second one here. So I'm going to put -1 minus the square root of 37, hit enter, and then divided by 6. So I get negative 1.18. The 0 will not round that 8 up. So these are your two answers. Looking at the next example. This one is not in standard form because it's not equal to 0. So I first have to start by subtracting 5 to the other side. So I get 2x squared minus 9x minus 5 equals 0. So now, here's my A, here's my B, and here's my C. So A is 2, B is negative 9, and C is negative 5. So now we're going to plug it into that quadratic formula from the front page. So x equals negative b. Well, b is negative 9, so a negative of a negative 9 would change that to a positive 9. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 9 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is negative 5. And then that whole thing is going to be divided by 2 times a, which is 2. So now simplifying this, we'll carry over the 9 plus or minus the square root. Negative 9 squared is 81. Negative 4 times 2 times negative 5 is 40. It's positive 40, so we'll put plus 40 all over 2 times 2 is 4. So simplifying that even further, carry over the 9 plus or minus the square root. 81 plus 40 is 121 divided by 4. We do know the square root of 121. If you don't even check that, you can still get the same answer if you want to. So splitting this up, you have 9 plus the square root of 121 over 4. And you have 9 minus the square root of 121 over 4. So putting these into the calculator, 9 plus the square root of 121, hit enter, and then divide that by 4. We get an answer of 5. And then 9 minus the square root of 121, hit enter, and divide that by 4. We get negative 0.5. And those are your two answers for that quadratic equation. Example 3 is not in standard form because it's not set equal to 0. So our first step is to subtract 1. So we have 7x squared minus 1 equals 0. This is now in standard form, but you'll notice that the term that had an x next to it is missing. So that we don't confuse ourselves, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this equation and put a plus 0x as a placeholder for that missing term. So now we clearly have an A, a B, and a C. So now I can plug into the formula. So x equals negative b. Well, negative 0 is still 0. That won't change. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 0 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 7, times c, which is negative 1. And that's all going to be divided by 2 times a, which is 7. So now, simplifying this, we have that 0 in the front, plus or minus the square root. 0 squared is 0. Negative 4 times 7 times negative 1 is positive 28. And that's all going to be divided by 2 times 7, which is 14. So now we have x equals 0 plus or minus the square root of 28 divided by 14. So we can put in 0 plus the square root of 28 divided by 14, and 0 minus the square root of 28 divided by 14. So putting that into the calculator, 0 plus the square root of 28, hit enter, and then hit divided by 14, we get 0.38. And then when you plug in 0 minus the square root of 28 and hit enter and divide by 14, you get negative 0.38, and those are your two answers. We've got one more example. So this one is already in standard form because it's set equal to 0. A is 5. Missing term 1 there, that's your B. And then negative 2 is your C. So plugging those into the quadratic formula, you got negative B. So B was 1, so now we have a negative 1. Plus or minus the square root of B squared. So we have 1 squared minus 4 times A, which is 5, times C, which is negative 2, all being divided by 2 times A, which is 5. So now, simplifying that down, bringing over the negative 1, plus or minus the square root. 1 squared is 1. Negative 4 times 5 times negative 2 is a positive 40. And that's all going to be divided by 2 times 5, which is 10. So let's see, I have x equals negative 1 plus or minus the square root. 1 plus 40 is 41, and that's going to be divided by 10. So I'm going to split this up. Negative 1 plus the square root of 41 divided by 10, and negative 1 minus the square root of 41 divided by 10. Now I can plug those into the calculator and get my answers. So negative 1 plus the square root of 41, divide that answer by 10, and we get 0.54. Put negative 1 minus the square root of 41, take that answer and divide it by 10, and we get negative 0.74. And those are your two answers. Don't forget to meet me tomorrow at 2 o'clock in Google Meet if you have any questions over this lesson.